it's nothing surprising that President Trump is in this situation, which I judge to be a win. And if he didn't win, he would anyhow say that he had won, and we would have had a constitutional crisis. All empires come to an end. There's no empire that has existed forever. So, like the Soviet Union went down at an early stage, this will happen now for the United States. And my deep concern is in which way will it go? Because the United States does not have a Gorbachev or a man with a vision of a better world, or a modest moral person as Gorbachev. And that means the next 4 years are going to be very, very, I would say, dangerous too. And I would say, unfortunately for all of those who have never been anti-American, this is very tragic, because the reason the U.S. is falling as an empire, and seems also as a society, is all of its own making. There's nobody threatening the United States. You have this idea that China is sitting there expanding and taking over the world and things like that. The apples are just falling down from the tree, unfortunately for the U.S. So I think the image I would use is Titanic is sailing on, but we know where that ends.
Yes, indeed. It's interesting that you use the Titanic actually symbol, because that is being used. Again, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khamenei, actually labeled the Titanic, basically, and sinking. Slowly but surely. Crossing over to Paris now, like to bring in radio host and journalist Jeff Brown. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, you heard our guest there in Sweden, and basically talking about what is happening and the dissipation of the United States, and basically it coming from its own doing. I want to look at that because, again, there's no country that's threatening them as far as war. There are no sanctions against the United States from other countries, no pressure from outside for the most part. And yet we see this deterioration inside. We have seen continually over decades now, a crumbling infrastructure that instead of spending money on roads, on schools, on hospitals, on the betterment of the average American, we have seen basically money going towards the industrial military complex and other interests of the 1%. Your take on that, Jeff?
Well, as far as China is concerned, and since I lived and worked there for 16 years, it's you hate to say it, but it's just all the better for China, because for the last 70 years since 1949. China has just gone from strength to strength. During the Mao era, it became an industrial juggernaut, and technologically and agriculturally and scientifically. And then since the Deng era and now the Xi era, it all plays into China's favor. And now whether it's Biden or Trump, it doesn't really matter. For the Chinese, they have been dealing with Bidens and Trumps and Obamas and Reagans going back to the times of the Persians and the Romans and the Greeks, and they have all the imperial records. And it's known that Mao actually and all the leaders of China consult imperial records going back thousands of years to see how to deal with different geopolitical situations and different styles of leaders. So if as the United States continues to decline, and the West in general, I mean, I'm here in France, it's also going downhill. The whole Western imperial model is of exploitation, extraction, expansionism, racism, evangelicism, etc. The colonial model is slowly dying. So that leaves the room for socialist anti-imperialist countries like Iran and Russia and China and the DPRK and Venezuela and Cuba and all the others to come in and hopefully offer humanity a more greater social justice and greater economic equality and global harmony.
Well, back to John in Sweden, your take on things. I mean, with what Jeff has said, what direction do you think that we could be heading in as, again, we see this decline in power out of Washington? And we've also seen somewhat of a divide between Europe and the United States. Do you think that the Europeans are going to be able to take a more independent path and basically space themselves, distance themselves from American imperial policies? Or basically, are they going to continue? When I'm talking about Europe, actually, I'm mainly talking about right now Germany and France and England. Are they just going to continue copy-paste the policies of the United States?
Well, I hope not. But let me say that I think when you're talking about the transatlantic relationship, I believe that much of what we see happening now and the decline and fall of the US has to do with how the West, and that was both Europe, but of course the US as a leader of the Western world, how they reacted to the fall of the wall in 89-90. You know, it was these promises given to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand an inch. It was this idea of a common European security space. It was the idea, at least some of us had, that when the Warsaw Pact had gone, there was no reason to have NATO, which was always the argument that NATO is there because there's a Soviet Union and a Warsaw Pact. So instead of taking this as an opportunity to create a new and better and more peaceful and balanced world, the United States started out, you know, with expanding, and that was Clinton. I consider Clinton one of the most destructive presidents internationally, with Yugoslavia, with all the things that happened after that, and the expansion of NATO. So, you know, if you take this mouthful, which is bigger than you can chew, you know, you're going to end up, and that's typical thing for an empire. An empire does overextension, and it thinks it can rule the whole world, and it thinks that its own values must be global. This is the Western Christian missionary thinking. And that is coming to an end now because, you know, the pupils in the class are no longer listening to the teacher. So, and the second thing is, I think the United States has gone down because of the MIMAC, the military industrial media academic complex. It does not have one. It is one MIMAC complex. And that is self-destructive. You know, these wars cost enormous sums in the civil society in the United States. So I think the future is dissolution. And if you ask me, I think, and that's the final thing I'm going to say to you in answer to your question, I think the ministries of foreign affairs of Europe were waking up this morning and saying, oh no, we had hoped for Biden. We had hoped that things would get back to normal, and it's not going back to normal whether Biden or Trump is winning, because it is a declining and eventually falling empire. And the problem is, I'm a Danish citizen. I live in Sweden. I know Europe fairly well. There is, as far as I know, not a single Ministry of Foreign Affairs that has a plan B for the fact that, you know, one day we cannot just listen to Washington and obey Washington and say, like, you know, repeat his master's voice. We will have to think independently. We will have to balance between a falling United States, who are our friends, and we should keep on being friends, and then opening up to the world, in other words, walking on two legs. I don't think they're able to do that. I hope they are. I don't think they are.
Well, it's interesting you brought up that. I mean, because if we look at since 1945, and of course the end of World War II, we have seen U.S. domination, and basically Western Europe immediately came under the fold of the U.S. And of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we basically saw the rest of Europe more or less following suit. So I guess the question is, what will it take for the Europeans to find its independence again after so many years? We're talking about from 1945, and we're dealing with 2020. Are they able to find an independent policy and abide by an independent policy? Because if we look at the situation in dealing with, for example, JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, and of course the United States basically made it null and void, and then pressured the Europeans to stand by them. On the surface, the Europeans said they disagreed with Washington, but in reality, they did very little, if anything, in trying to have economic relations with Iran. So my question staying there in Sweden is, what do you think it will take?
Well, it would take a completely new paradigm in the decision-making circles of parliaments, ministries of foreign affairs and defense. It would take a preparation for a different defense system, a different way of thinking what security is that is not NATO's. This mantra of stability and security and peace that you hear Mr. Stoltenberg say, it's just a mantra. It has nothing to do with the world. It's nothing to do with reality. If as I used to say, if weapons were the road to peace, we would have a wonderfully peaceful world. And that's not the case. What we do have is a European Union who is without a real leadership. I mean, we have good people like Angela Merkel. The rest of them are without a vision. If you ask them, where do you want Europe to be in 40 years from now, which is what the Chinese have asked themselves, where do we want China to be in 40 years? You would not hear anything interesting. There's no Willy Brandt left. There's no de Gaulle left. There's no Olof Palme left. There's none of these who were Gorbachev in politics. There's none of these, visionary people who could make the Europeans 400 million plus people say, yes, this is where we should go. They have all been, whenever there was a challenge from Yugoslavia, the European Union was the one that started, caused, released, and made unavoidable the war in Bosnia. If you take the refugee crisis in 2015, they were all split. If you take the question of the corona, the EU did not stand up, act together. We have China and Russia coming in helping the Italians, because there was no common thinking in the European Union. And you can go on like this. You mentioned the JCPOA. I mean, the European states have accepted secondary sanctions as sovereign states on their territory that American law applies to the European space. Right. This is outrageous in my view. If you are a union and your treaty, the Treaty of Lisbon, tells you that you are the first goal of the European Union is to make peace in the world. I mean, so I think we, unfortunately, and I say this with pain in my heart, I don't think that at the moment, and what we've seen the last few years, there's nothing that indicates that the European Union as Europeans, as an identity, as a new alternative in the eyes of the world to the United States leadership will happen.
Well, Jeff, turning back to Paris, you were talking about more socialist-like elements actually being the way of the future. Let's look at the United States itself. I mean, the word socialism, the average American almost appears fearful of the word socialism. And of course, if it's communism, even more fearful. A lot of it is because even a lack of understanding of socialism in general. When you're talking about a country that the majority of people more and more are under pressure, a semi-socialist system would actually be quite beneficial. But when you're dealing with a populace that has been so ingrained to think negatively about such a system, I mean, where do you see this going in the United States?
I would like to, the comments, I'm sorry I missed his name, the gentleman that just talked, he made some very good points. What's his name?
Jan Oberg out of Lund.
Okay, Jan Oberg, great. Since 1945, the United States has embedded thousands and thousands and thousands of pro-American bureaucrats, politicians, journalists into Europe. They're just embedded like termites, and so in NATO, in Brussels. So it's extreme. It's going to take a lot. The United States has invested a lot to infect internally the Europeans' governance, and so it's going to take a lot to get rid of all those people, and it may take the collapse of the United States for it to happen. To go back to socialism, the United States was at its best in its history was when it was semi-socialist during the New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and when Roosevelt essentially nationalized industry in the 1940s to beat in World War II. They basically nationalized the entire economy, just like China does, and the DPRK, and Iran does a lot too, and Venezuela, Russia, with their state-owned corporations. That was when the United States was at its very best in terms of solidarity and working together and having a common goal. But unfortunately, it lasted long enough to save capitalism. And then, the oligarchs and the deep state, the CIA was created in 1947, the National Security Administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all were created by Truman. And that New Deal kind of lasted into the 60s and 70s, and then with the start of the Reagan era, the neoliberal model that really took over. It's all going away now, and so we have been brainwashed. We have been brainwashed to hate. Pavlovian response. We're brainwashed in the Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia, New Zealand, England, Canada, the United States, and in some places, for some people here in France. I mean, I talk to people who just get apoplectic when you talk about the Communist Party here. So we have been brainwashed to fear socialism because it is a threat to capitalism. And that is not our oligarchs our oligarchs in our deep state are not going to give that up without going down in flames, basically, and that would be the collapse of Western empire.
Jeff, you made some interesting points, and when you talk about an FDR U.S. and you said that was at its best and more state-owned entities, and it's interesting how that term state-owned has taken on negative connotations now. If we look at the U.S. Mainstream media, if they're talking about, for example, let's say Press TV, they will say state-owned media to make it sound extremely negative and not being free. Of course, they don't use that same combination when they're describing BBC. And we have so many other examples of this brainwashing that is taking place. And I'm going to switch back over to Sweden. And what do you think, though, it is going to take as far as the people and the way they are thinking? Because what Jeff has talked about just now, so apropos, and talking about the embedding of these intellectuals throughout Europe, making sure that that U.S. neoliberal agenda is propagated.
Well, if you're asking me about that, I mean, I don't think at this moment it's rather unlikely. However you define socialism, forget it about the United States. I think what I see as a very clear indicator in cultural terms, and generally people who comment on things, scholars who work with international affairs, are looking too much on, in my view, on material and economic things. If you look at culture, ways of thinking, very interesting difference between the East and the West, if you will, the United States, Europe, and China on the other side, is that China walks on many legs. You know, it's socialism, it's capitalism, it's Buddhism, it's Confucianism, and it's this kind of Chinese-ness of thinking about their society as a family and things like that. The West is also characterized after 89, 90 by having one solution to everything, not a both and thinking, not even a mixed state like in Sweden. It all went neoliberal. And it didn't say that there were certain sectors of the Western society that could be neoliberal, market oriented, and then there would be a state building infrastructure and things like that. It said everything is going to be privatized. Everything is doing. This is what the World Bank has done, or this is what the International Monetary Fund. The message has been, our model of a one-legged economy, which is very vulnerable, instead of walking on more legs and more feet, is where you end up now. And the same goes with, the hammer called the military, industrial, media, academic complex. Whatever problem the United States has seen the last few years in the international society, has it been about selling weapons, it's been starting a war, it's been interventionism, it has been spreading bases, it has been always the military first. Now, that destroys any empire. The moment there's an unbalance in terms of power rankings between economic power, political power, legitimacy power, cultural power, and military power, you're already on your way down. And that's why I said in the beginning of this conversation that the United States fall or decline has been happening for a long time. The only difference is that Trump will make that decline go faster. If you don't want the American empire, you should be happy today, in my view. So long story short, there is a cultural way of thinking that is coming to an end, and that's the Western model. And that intellectual armament that we need, that's the only armament we need. I am wondering whether that is possible, because also research and intellectual work has been, subsumed under the state. Most research institutes and think tanks today are state financed or financed by private corporations. My little foundation here, the Transnational Foundation in Sweden, with 50 people around the world, is one of the very few, probably a handful in the business of peace and conflict research, which is not dependent on the state and corporations. And we do say different things, because if you take a state institute, they say completely different things from what we say. So, there is a reason, there's a confluence of things happening, of which Trump is, the embodiment, so to speak. But it's nothing new, what is happening now. All empires fall, as I said, at some point.
Well, definitely some interesting points that you've made. And I want to turn back to Paris and Jeff about some of those points. I want to actually expand on that and looking at the independent, the intellectuals, the academics. You talked about the Reagan era. And of course, we know that it started with the trickle-down economics that basically never trickled down. And we saw from then on, basically the neoliberal agenda continually to peak. Where is the independent voice? Where are the intellectuals, the academics that should be informing the people of the reality and the effect, the true effect of these type of economic policies? So perhaps people could make a better judgment during elections and understanding what is really at stake.
Well, I think there was quite a bit of academic freedom post-war, and even back into the 20s and 30s and 40s, et cetera. There was a more vibrant, more varied media in the West. The problem is that it has been consolidated with this neoliberal model, and Europe is not as bad as the U.S., but it's getting that way. But basically, right now, because of all this consolidation, leverage buyouts, and mergers and acquisitions, and et cetera, with thousands and thousands of radio stations and magazines and newspapers and book publishers, et cetera, television stations have been consolidated now in the West into about 8 or 9 huge, multi-billion-dollar transnational media corporations, and And so now, and who owns these multi-billion-dollar media corporations? Well, it's our oligarchs, and the global capitalists who own these corporations. They're the ones that have all the A shares and the preferred stock, and they're on the board of directors, and they're in the executive departments of these media behemoths. And so they now have basically taken their voice is what we are hearing. We then had the internet in the 1990s and the 2000s, and there was a resurgence of expression, a lot of variety, and and that wasn't going to last very long because these oligarchs want to control everything. And so now you see censorship. I'm being censored. Hundreds of thousands of social media accounts are being shut down all over the world. Not just liberal, socialist, communist, or whatever, libertarian. I mean, anybody who is not for the oligarchic, global capitalist viewpoint, the World Trade Organization, supposedly free markets, taxation on the 99%, et cetera. If you're against any of that now, you're getting shut down on the internet, and so now they are taking control of the internet because that was too much for them to be able to handle that kind of informational competition. So what can I say? And you talk to professors in the United States. You can't express. There's no academic freedom. Michael Parenti had that great speech, that great talk he gave. It's on YouTube. He wrote a book about academic freedom. He started out in Yale and Princeton, and he's a socialist / communist, and then he ends up in a smaller university, and then he ends up in a college, and then you end up in a junior college. If you speak up, you're going to get crushed academically. And it's an endless fight.
Let me just jump in there, Jeff. You made some interesting points, and we talk about the academic side of things. And yes, I mean, I know many professors who no longer could even work. You talk about a junior college. Some of them could no longer even get a job teaching at a high school. Others have had to leave the United States and teach elsewhere. Why didn't the other academics stand up? I think this is one of the main problems that has happened in Western society. Whereas before, for example, you had tenured professors, and I mean, basically had their jobs very much secured. But we have seen professors, for example, talking about the Zionist regime, talking about the influence that Israel has in the United States, or just the crimes that Tel Aviv commit against Palestinians, and have basically, even tenured professors have basically lost their jobs, and on so many other issues also. I guess the question is, what happened to that independent thinking academic that would at least stand up for the others when they're losing their jobs? We have seen journalists that have stood up, for example, talking about, again, the Palestinian issue, losing their jobs. Where are the independent elite that will actually stand up for those who are not getting their rights?
Well, I interviewed the people who translated Progressive Press, who translated Olfcott's book about prostitutes, and basically the independent voices are co-opted by money. These foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, George Soros. If you need money, you need grant money, you need money, to publish or whatever, they're there, and you're going to sing their tune. They also use, as Olfcott explained, they use blackmail. They use extortion. They use bribery. So they do not hesitate to what I call use the imperial toolbox to control people, and a lot of it is just they flatter you, and they give you insider information, and you go on, you get to speak, get speaking tours, and phony medals and phony prizes, for this and that. They flatter you, and so you either end up like Michael Parenti, teaching in a small college someplace, or you really stand up for what's right and what's truthful, and you end up being a professor in China or in Iran or in some other country, and making half as much as you were. So it's tough. Every day I wake up and I go, got to get back out there and keep writing and keep reporting, no matter how depressing and discouraging it gets.
I hear you, Jeff. And on that note, I'm going to have to end it here, but I appreciate you being with us out of Paris, Jeff Brown, radio host and journalist, and out of Lund, Sweden, Jan Oberg, founder of transnational.org. Appreciate you being with us also. And also, viewers, thanks so much for staying with us right here at Press TV's headquarters. But I'm going to toss it back over to London. Well, they will take it.
All right. Thank you for joining us, sir. And take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.